Good morning, all. My name is John Winston. Welcome to this webinar on Irish pasture-based dairy systems. I am an agricultural economist, and I work on issues of agriculture and the environment. I look for and try to work with win-win solutions, things that boost farm profits and reduce negative environmental impacts. And I believe very strongly that dairy grazing is such a win-win for farming and the environment. Unfortunately, the dairy sector in the US seems to be steamrolling towards large modern confinement dairy. And this webinar series on Irish dairy grazing is being put on by two projects, and I'm involved with both of those. The projects have a focus on low overhead dairy grazing systems, somewhat similar to the Irish system, as a way to create long-term profitability in a very competitive dairy sector. And both projects are also helping dairy farmers to get started in grazing. You'll find information, we'll put in the chat information on both these projects. One project is supporting farmers in the 11 northeastern states, going as far south as Maryland and Delaware. And that project is funded by the Northeast Dairy Business Innovation Center. We'll put a link to the DBIC in the chat also for those who want more info. But the Northeast DBIC offers grant programs to dairy farmers, processors, and technical assistance providers. And with funding from them, I'm leading a project through my LLC called Conservation Performance. It's working in the Northeast on dairy grazing. The other project, which is led by the Wallace Center at Winrock International, for which I also work, is supporting farmers in the Great Lakes Basin. And that project has many facets, and it's funded by the Great Lakes Basin Program. And GLPF, as we call them, they understand that more acres in well-managed pasture means less nutrients and sediments getting into the Great Lakes. That's why they care about this. As I said, there are many facets to dairy grazing, and there's some important environmental benefits. This is the first webinar in a three-part mini-series focused on Irish dairy farming. And today's webinar will be an overview of Irish dairy farming, including some information on managing pasture, forage, and supplemental feeding. The second webinar, which is going to be in 2 weeks on February 19th, will be a deeper dive into pasture management and feeding in Ireland. And the third webinar, which will be on March 12th, and that one will try to cover topics that you all have told us would be of greatest interest and value to you. So thanks to those who have put suggestions for topics in with the registration information. You can also put suggestions into the chat of this webinar, or you could email me. Before I introduce our presenter, we have a few poll questions to better understand who is on this webinar. And so if you'd be willing to answer these questions as they pop up on your screen, that would be very helpful. And we'll share the results with you as soon as we have them. First question is there.
So I think the results are shared now, John, but it looks like we have a majority of government agency staff, NGO staff, university staff, and then some non-dairy farmers, and then a couple of dairy farmers are also in the room.
Got it. Thank you. Can you go to, do you want to roll to the other questions, Elizabeth, or?
Yep, I think that makes sense. So next up, we wanted to understand for the folks who are technical assistance providers in the room, the next couple of questions are for you folks specifically. Answer this first question to let us know if you are a technical assistance provider to dairy farmers. All right, and it looks like about 2/3 of the folks on the call are technical assistance providers to dairy farmers. And then the next question is about what kinds of TA services you all provide, if you said yes to that last question. Launching now.
And in this question, Elizabeth, I think they can select multiple.
That's correct.
So whichever areas you do work on, select all of them.
Great. Great to see these responses going in. On this one, I'll note we have a lot of folks selecting other. I'd be curious if you could put what other services you offer in the chat. I will show everyone the results of this one as well. A lot of folks here who support farmers on grazing management. Not surprising, but also good to see who we're talking with. And then the next couple of questions are for the farmers in the room. So I am going to launch. If you are a dairy farmer, how many cows are in your milking herd? Oh, hang on. I have to actually end the previous question, it looks like. Okay, there we go. Oh, good to see that the whole Northeast DBIC team is on. Thanks, Laura.
I also failed to introduce Elizabeth, who's helping, who's launching these poll questions. Elizabeth Spratt is a colleague of mine in the Wallace Center at Winrock, as well as Jane Jordan, two of my colleagues there. So they're helping to support the webinars, which is greatly appreciated and a huge help.
Yeah, thanks, John. For the few farmers that we have in the room, dairy farmers that we have in the room, it is an even split across farm sizes. And then we have a question for you all about grazing. I'm going to launch that one, and then we just have one more after that. So if you are a dairy farmer, do you graze your milking herd when pasture forage is available?
Not surprising. It seems like all the farmers on this call are grazers, which is great.
Great.
Elizabeth and Jane, one question. I know we had over 100 people register. And is it possible that anybody's in the waiting room or not able to get in because we have a much smaller group?
Yeah, so we're clicking to admit people as soon as they enter the waiting room. So no one's in the waiting room right now. And we're keeping an eye on our email too to make sure we get everyone in.
Thank you.
All right, last question on seasonality. If you do seasonal calving or not. And it looks like for the dairy folks who are on the call, all of them are doing mostly spring calving. So that's great to know, and great to know for our speaker today as he goes into the details of how this all works in Ireland.
Yes, thank you very much for answering those poll questions. That's helpful. I'm glad we have some farmers on the call. I was hoping we would have a few more, and we'll see maybe in the second and third webinars, we will. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just remind folks to please keep their microphones muted during the presentation so there's not background noise coming in and interfering. And we are planning to allow time, adequate time for a question and answer period. And you're welcome to put questions into the chat at any time during the presentation or during the Q&A session. You also will have the option to use the raise hand function in Zoom to ask a question orally during the Q&A. But we do ask, we won't interrupt the presentation to try to answer questions until the Q&A period. So let me introduce our speaker. I'm very happy to be able to introduce Dr. Padraig French as our presenter today. Padraig is based in Teagasc, Moorpark, in the southern part of the Republic of Ireland. I hope I pronounced all that correctly.
Yep.
He's the head of the Livestock Systems Department in Teagasc. His research has included dairy farm systems, low-cost wintering systems, grassland management, dairy calf to beef production, and animal nutrition. Padraig has worked on research projects in the UK, New Zealand, and Tanzania. He's the past president of the Irish Grassland Association, and he also is an active dairy farmer. So we're very grateful to have Padraig with us, and let me turn the floor over to him. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. Hope you can all hear me okay, and I hope you can all understand my Irish accent. If not, stick it in the chat and we'll get someone to interpret. Okay, so as John said, I'm going to focus on Irish pasture-based systems and try and, I suppose, extrapolate to the current context in the US. The slides might go on. Okay, so an overview, I suppose, of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to do a bit of background about Irish dairy production statistics and a bit about the Irish dairy industry. Then I'm going to focus on the farm systems in Ireland and the profitability of those systems. Then we're going to move on to breeding a cow for that system. Then focus deep. I suppose today we'll just touch on pasture management. The next session is more deeper into pasture management. And finally, a quick overview of the outlook for the industry and the challenges that the dairy industry in Ireland faces, and that's relevant to pasture-based systems globally. Okay, so firstly, for those of you who don't know where Ireland is, I said I'd get a little map to show it. We're stuck in the northeast part of the Atlantic Ocean. We're quite far north relative to where you are. We're between 52 and 54 degrees north, which would probably drop us into somewhere in Hudson Bay, to put it in perspective of where we are. We're a small little island, about 32,000 square miles, which is roughly the same size as South Carolina. If we were in the US, we'd be the 43rd largest state. Because of the Atlantic Ocean all around us, and because of a current that comes from the Gulf of Mexico, or the Gulf of America, I think you call it now, we have a relatively temperate climate. The winters here, typically about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and in summer it gets up to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So quite a comfortable zone for growing grass and for grazing livestock. We get about 40 inches of rain, which is relatively uniformly distributed, but because of our distance north, our latitude, we get very little evapotranspiration during the winter. So our soils get saturated during the winter. Temperatures are low enough that pasture doesn't grow during the winter, so we have to provide feed other than pasture during the winter months. But I'll touch on that in more detail later on. Okay, so just some statistics about Ireland. And I suppose the first thing I should say, Ireland politically is divided into the Republic of Ireland in the south, which is 26 counties, and 6 counties in the north, which is called Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. So politically divided from agriculturally and particularly from a dairy industry, it's really one unit. Okay, because it's the same processors process milk, all of the milk as one. But the statistics I'm going to give you are mostly from the Republic of Ireland, which is the larger end of it. So in I'm just going to give, I suppose, some gross statistics. Firstly, we produce about 8.8 billion litres of milk, which is about 19.5 billion pounds of milk, and then a further 5.5 billion pounds of milk in Northern Ireland, which is roughly equivalent in volume to Wisconsin in terms of total milk production. So we'd be, quite a large milk producer. We don't have the scale that you have at farm level. We don't have any mega dairies. Okay, our farms are family owned and operated, have been passed down through generations within the same family largely. And because we're pasture based, there's a limit to the scale that we can operate at. Our average farm size, just 93 cows. But there's a range from, I suppose, the smaller farms have to be a size that's viable, which is 40 to 50 cows, and can go up to what's physically grazable, which is probably 400 to 500 cows would be at the upper end of the scale. But on average, about 93 cows, relatively low milk production per cow, somewhere around 12,000 pounds of milk per cow, or about 1.1 million pounds of milk per dairy farm. Irish farmers are paid for milk on a system called A plus B minus C, which means that they're paid per kilogram of fat, per kilogram of protein, with a minus on volume. And the reason is that all of our milk is processed into products and the water has to be removed from it. So farmers are really paid for kilograms of fat and protein, what we call kilograms of milk solids. And that's what the focus is in our systems. The unusual things about our industry in a global context is that we are very, very seasonal. Over 90% of our cows calve in the spring at the start of the grass growing season and produce milk from pasture for 9 to 10 months and are then dried off for the winter months. Okay. The other unusual thing is that almost 90% of what we produce has to be exported. As you can see, the island of Ireland is producing about 25 billion pounds of milk. We have only a population on the island of about 6.5 million people. Ireland, incidentally, is the only country in the world that has a smaller population now than it had 200 years ago. Okay, so we have quite a small population, and there's a lot of history in that I won't go into why that is. But we have to export the majority of the milk we produce. We're exporting onto a global market, and therefore we have to be competitive in production of milk. Our milk is primarily processed by co-ops. Okay, all of our milk processing is owned by the farmers who produce the milk, and we have lots of small co-ops. They achieve scale at processing level by jointly owning processing facilities, and they achieve scale on the export by having one co-op that exports on behalf of all the other co-ops. So that gives us global scale for export. That's just, I suppose, a map of Ireland, just showing the processing structure. And as you can see, highly integrated between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But I should say that because of climate, because of historical reasons, about 2/3 of the milk production happens in the southern 1/3 of the country in the area called Munster, which is in the southwest. That's where the dairy industry is dominated. In terms of what we do with our milk, then, I suppose, as we have somewhere around 18 billion pounds of milk for manufacturing in the Republic of Ireland. And as I said, it's processed into products because we are seasonal and we are a long distance from our markets. We have to have long shelf life products. I suppose our number one product, and you might recognize this one down in the bottom right-hand corner, this Kerrygold butter. Might have seen it on shop shelves in America. It's about 60% of our milk is processed, of the milk fat ends up in butter. And we produce, because our cows are fed on grass, the grass contains beta carotene, which ends up inside in the fat cells in the mammary gland and ends up making our milk fat yellow. Because our cows are eating grass and grass contains long chain polyunsaturates, and it also, grass passes through the rumen very quickly, very high rumen degradability. So fat becomes only partially hydrogenated compared to a grain or silage-based diet. The fat is much less hydrogenated on a grass diet. So we end up with a lot of unsaturated fats, long chain unsaturated fats getting into the milk fat. That combined with the color difference is what makes our butter relatively unique. So it's a pasture, I suppose, fed butter. We market it globally as grass fed. We only produce that butter during the main grazing season for about 6 months, and we export it to 144 countries in the world. And it keeps, I suppose, a premium of between 50 and 100% over local butter. Okay, and our number one market for that butter is Germany. Our number two market is actually the USA. Some of the other products then that we produce, a lot of the rest of the milk fat ends up inside in cheeses. Again, because of our distance and our seasonality, they're hard cheeses, predominantly cheddar, on our main market being the UK. The milk protein and lactose that's remaining after making butter is primarily dried into powder, which we put into the infant formula industry, or else we add back milk fat and produce a product called fat-filled powder, which we export to Africa. Okay, much more heat stable than whole milk powder, and also obviously cheaper than whole milk powder. So that's, I suppose, a quick snapshot of some of the main ingredients that we produce, or the main dairy products that we produce in Ireland. I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit about our farm system of production in Ireland. It's very much focused on turning grass into milk, and it's focused on doing that as low cost and competitively as possible. We are, I suppose, exporting onto a global market. We have to compete with whoever else is on that global market at that time. And because we're family farms and they're family owned and operated, they have to have a viable income every year. They can't do things like roll up significant debt over time when milk price goes down. They have to be continuously viable. So fundamentally, I suppose what our system of production is about is turning solar energy into human food, and using grass and cows to do that as efficiently and as profitably as possible. And I suppose the three areas that we're going to focus on today is to focus on the system and how important the system is. Secondly, having the right type of cow for the system. And the third part is on the forage, which is predominantly perennial ryegrass swards with white clover. Okay, they're 99.9% of the swards in Ireland sown down are perennial ryegrass swards with white clover incorporated on it. I suppose our systems are also very dependent on having people that are highly skilled because they're owner operated. So they have to have their business managers, but they're also the operators that are milking the cows. And I suppose the other thing, we have to continuously innovate to keep up to the systems globally that we have to compete with. So in terms of our farm systems, I suppose we want them obviously to be profitable, but also they have to be relatively simple. Okay, that we can't have complicated systems that require a lot of decision making, because we have one person usually owning and operating the farm. Okay, and if they need time off the farm, they're bringing in relief. They have to have the ability to outsource the work for short periods of time. We want our systems resilient, and resilience is a key theme we're going to focus on later. But resilient is really important because, as I said, they're family farms. They have to cope with the shocks, both climate and price shocks that happen over time. Environmental sustainability is also really important. Particularly around carbon emissions and water quality, and we'll touch on that later. And I suppose the last thing is our systems have to be repeatable. So what I'm going to do now is try and describe our system as best I can. So the top graph that you see there, the green wedge, represents grass growth in Ireland. Now, we measure it in kilograms of grass dry matter produced per hectare. But typically, our farms will produce approximately 5.5 tons of grass dry matter per acre. Okay, so grass growth, because of temperature, is very low during the winter months. It starts growing in February, March, but really doesn't take off the high growth rates until April, May. And we get quite consistent growth rates through the summer because we usually have adequate rainfall. We do suffer summer droughts, maybe 1 year in 5, and generally confined to the eastern end of the country. And grass growth then slows off again in the autumn, October, November, and completely stops by December. The red line represents the demand of our farms. When our farms are stocked with approximately 1 cow per acre, okay? And that is where most farms operate, typically around that 1 cow per acre of a stocking rate. There's not a big range around that. We go from maybe 0.8 up to 1.2 cows per acre, but there are environmental restrictions and regulations that restrict going to very high stocking rates. The cows calve here in February. So this bottom graph represents what the cow is doing in the system. So the cows calve in February, March every year, and they're turned out to pasture. So during the winter months, they're off pasture and they're usually fed on grass silage. They can be off wintered on crops, but it's primarily on grass silage. And as they calve, they're turned out to pasture. Generally within a day or two of calving, they go out and begin to graze. And they graze for usually 8 to 10 months of the year. But here for 3 to 4 months of the year, there's more grass growing than what the cows require. And this is harvested as silage, which is usually fed back at periods of deficit or during the winter months. Okay, during midsummer, the extra forage here is started to build up. We build up the farm cover, the amount of grass grown on the farm, and graze it through to fill some of this deficit. The big challenge for our cows is that our cows have to calve at the same time every year. Okay, so they calve at the start of the grass growing season. They have then to conceive within about 80 to 90 days. And if they don't do that, the cows are culled at the end of the grass growing season. Okay, if they don't conceive, in this period to calve again the following year. And that's a big biological challenge. We'll touch on that when we get to the cows later. In terms of our system, there's 2 really important concepts that drive it, 2 key performance indicators. Okay, firstly, milk production per cow has no relationship to profit. What drives profit on our farms is the amount of grass utilized. What drives resilience, or cost of production, or margin, is the percentage grass in the diet. Okay, and these are the 2 key drivers of our system. The proportion of the grass in the diet gives us a low cost of production if it's high, and growing a lot of grass and utilizing a lot of grass gives us a lot of profit. The reason that tons of grass utilized equals profit is because there's a margin in turning grazed grass into milk. Simple as that. Grazed grass we can produce relatively cheaply compared to concentrates. So concentrates are a supplement that we buy, which is predominantly grain-based, some minerals included, but they are 4 to 5 times the price of concentrates. Grass silage, about 2.5 times. So this is the grass that's conserved in the summer, fed back during the winter, costs about 2.5 times the cost of grazed grass. Okay, on an energy basis. But fundamentally, if we grow more grass, turn that into milk, there's profit in it. And the more tons of grass we grow and utilize, then the more profit. And that's just data showing that relationship, that very close correlation between profit. And pretty much if we want to predict the profit of a farm, we just need to calculate how much grass they're utilizing. This, I suppose, tries to show the relationship or how important resilience is. This was actually produced about 20 years ago in a study where they looked at grazing globally, and they showed that as you increase the proportion of grass in the diet, which is here on the bottom axis, then the total cost of production comes down. Okay, very high correlation across about 10 countries. But the important thing here is that it's not a linear reduction, it's quadratic. So what's happening here is that as you come into this high level of grass utilization, a lot of grass in the diet, the costs come down really fast. Because initially, when you put in grass in the diet, you actually don't have much in effect. You just drop the milk production and you drop your feed costs. But where we are sitting here at 70–80% grass in the diet, once we put in more grass in the diet, we're dropping our fixed costs as well as our variable costs and not getting the drop in milk production. So it has a big impact on our cost of production. Okay, so this is what determines where we are in terms of cost of production, which allows us to cope with the volatility or the shocks that happen on global price markets. Just another graph showing the family farm income, and it shows it's quite volatile, which is primarily driven by milk price. But compared to any other enterprise in Ireland, dairying is actually quite profitable. Generally, the farmers make about €1,000, and the euro at the moment is very close on a par with the dollar. So approximately $1,000 per cow is the average farm profit, but it varies a lot around that. Okay, and if you look at it, I suppose in terms of kilograms of milk solids, you're approximately $2 per cow. So our cows are typically producing about 450 kilograms of milk, of fat and protein. Just showing, I suppose, one of the big things in the last decade since we had milk quotas in Ireland for 35 years, which basically stagnated us from 1984 to 2015. Since then, milk quotas have been abolished and we have doubled milk solids production in that period. And that's fundamentally because it's a profitable thing to do in Ireland. Okay, so we've doubled milk solids production between 2015 and 2023. I'm going to move on now to our cows, okay? And the cows in our grassland system in Ireland. And I suppose fundamentally, the first thing, we don't breed cows to produce more milk, okay? In intensive indoor systems, cows are bred to produce more milk, and the system is adopted to facilitate the cow to do that. In Ireland, we have a very defined system, and we breed cows to make more profit within that system, okay? So that's our focus of our breeding program in Ireland. And we breed cows for that system. So our cows have to calve every 12 months, okay, in a grazing cow. A really important thing with our cows, they have to withstand the fluctuating feed supply. So what that means is that when the cows are at peak milk production, grazing conditions can vary a lot from day to day depending on the weather. And the cows have to be able to cope with that. And days when they get a reduced feed, we need them to drop milk production. Okay, if a cow maintains milk production with a reduced feed intake, she's going to end up mobilizing body condition score, and that's going to make her unsuitable to stay within the system. She's not going to be able to breed and go back and calf. So we need a cow that can cope with fluctuating feed supply and maintain body condition score. But we also need them to be able to eat a lot of grass when it's available. So we need to be able to get high grass intakes. We need cows that can survive in a large herd scenario. We don't want a lot of labor per cow. We need our cows to continue to calve every year for at least 5 lactations. So we need healthy and resilient animals, and we need cows that can produce approximately 90% of their body weight. So that's a 550 kilo cow producing somewhere around 500 kilograms of milk solids from a pasture-based system. Okay. There's a lot of data here on this, but it's just showing an overview of our breeding goal. And I suppose really all you need to focus here on the right and on the headings on the far left. So about a third of our breeding goal is on milk production. That's much less than what is in most other countries, where we are negative on milk volume and we're focusing on kilograms of fat and protein. And another third of our breeding goal is on fertility. We want that cow to calve every year at the same time. It's really important for a pasture-based system, and we want those cows to survive. So they're the main traits in our breeding goals. We also have calving, maintenance, beef, health, and management as other traits, but much less in terms of their emphasis. I'm going to move on to pasture-based systems and just a quick overview on what happens in terms of pasture management. And I'm showing you the front page from a decision support tool that we have called Pasture-Based Ireland. And this is basically a database that each farmer every week to manage their pasture, they walk the farm and they assess the amount of grass in each paddock. And they do that either visually or with a plate meter, or some of them train their eye with quadrants and cutting grass. And when they do that, they input the data into this decisions portal. They have an app on their phone that they input the data into, and that goes straight into national database. Okay. And that is obviously very useful to us because we have that database here in Moore Park, and we know how much grass is growing on about 30,000 fields in Ireland. At any one day, we can predict and we can look at what grass growth has been and how the farmers are managing the pasture. But the farmers have three tools that they use for managing grass. In the spring, they use an area-based allocation. So our cows are just starting to calve now, start of February, and the farmers will allocate the area to make the first rotation last until we meet grass growth equals demand. This is a key day for us when if you remember this wedge, the green line here representing grass growth, the red line representing the feed demand. Here in April, this is what we call Magic Day, when we're growing enough grass to feed the herd. Okay, and I say we focus on the area allocation from now until Magic Day, which is usually the first week of April. Right through the summer months, we're focused on the grass wedge. Okay, I'll touch on that in the next slide. And then in the autumn, we switch back to an area-based allocation. Again, we want to slow down the rotation. Okay, we generally operate here in the summer at about a 20-day rotation, but we vary it every week depending on grass growth. Okay, any surplus grass on our farms we harvest as grass silage. If we have a deficit every week, we put in concentrates or silage. In the autumn, we slow down the area. Again, we slow out the rotation, an area-based allocation every day, every week, until we shut down the farm, usually in late November. And there's a target farm cover that we shut down the farm at again in November to have grass for the spring. And we prioritize grass in the spring. In both the spring and the autumn, if we don't have enough grass, we'll supplement with grain at first and our concentrates. And then if there's not, like, we'll generally only feed 4 to 5 kilograms per day of grain. And if they require more than that, we'll feed grass silage to fill any deficits that is on the area allocated. But we stick rigidly to an area allocation. Just, I suppose, quickly on the feed wedge. So every week when the farmer assesses how much grass is in the paddock, they input it into this decision support tool, which plots it on a wedge, which shows from the highest highest grass cover paddock to the lowest. The red line represents where they want it to be. If the wedge is looking that there's a lot of grass above this red line, there's a surplus on the farm and the farmer can take it out and make silage of it and then look at what impact it has, and they can use this decision support tool to help guide them through this process. Okay, and it's a live, I suppose, feed that they can put in silage, put in concentrates, and see what impact it has on the wedge. Okay. Okay, I'm coming near an end. I think my time is getting tight. I said I'd touch on some of the outlook and the challenges for the dairy industry in Ireland. In terms of outlook, I suppose from the positive side, we believe at the moment we have a very profitable and competitive industry that's very much focused on pasture-based systems. The systems are largely well understood by farmers and they understand the KPIs. Okay, so they are the positive sides of it. They understand, that grass utilized drives profit and that they need to focus on percentage grass in the diet. We're fortunate that from a government perspective, we have strong, I suppose, political and policy support to support the industry and to promote the type of system that we're doing. And we are able to get a premium on the world markets for grass-fed milk products. And that's the predominant system of production in Ireland. We do face a number of headwinds at the moment, and we always do. I suppose at the moment, some of our challenges, generational renewal is a very big challenge for us. We have an economy that's, I think, we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world at the moment. And because of that, we have full employment at the moment. And there's lots of opportunities for young people. And we have a challenge getting enough of them to come into the dairy industry and continue dairy farming. We have been given a challenge to reduce our CO2 emissions by 25% by 2030. That's the entire agricultural sector, but is dominated by the dairy industry. And we also have a significant challenge around water quality. So reducing our water footprint, reducing the amount of nutrients getting into both surface water and groundwater. Phosphorus into the surface waters and nitrogen into the groundwater. And I suppose lastly, one of our challenges as well is having a secure outlet for our calves. Like our cows calve every year. We use sex semen. The cow produces about 5 calves in her life. Only one of those is required for replacement. The other 4 have to find another home. And at the moment, about 20% of our calves are live exported into European veal industry, and that's considered an unsustainable outlet for our calves. So we have to find alternatives and put all of them suitable and integrated into our beef industry, which is a grass-based steer beef industry in Ireland. So I suppose that's a quick snapshot of the challenges that we face. So I suppose in conclusion, and I think I'm still on time, John. The pasture-based systems, they can, I suppose, if they're operated right, can deliver lower feed costs, okay? Because grass-based systems, grass is a cheaper feed to produce and to utilize in situ. They can have lower fixed costs when the percentage grass in the diet is high. And I suppose the key performance indicators are to focus on the percentage grass in the diet and to achieve high tons of grass utilized, which is about growing a lot of grass and having the stocking rate right to match it. And I suppose the last part of it is that the cow has to be right for the system, okay? That you need to breed a cow for a pasture-based system. Okay, that's me done. Hope I've stuck to the message, John, and that we're on time.
Yes, on both. Thank you very much, Padraig. That was really informative, great, and right on time. So good job. I appreciate it. We do have 15 minutes or so for Q&A. There are a few questions in the chat. Let me just start by one that I put in there, if I could. As an economist, of course, I'm interested in farm profitability. And when you say that farm profitability is really determined by the percentage of grass utilization, to me, that implies that all the other cost structure of the Irish dairy farms is all pretty much the same. Is that true? Like, are there not wide variations in things like labor efficiency or investment structure of the farm or anything like that?
Yeah, I suppose a couple of points on it. In terms of investment, our farmers have very low levels of indebtedness. They fund most of the development of the farms out of cash flow rather than through debt. And there's historical reasons for that, why they're averse to taking on debt. A lot of the farms are inherited rather than bought and sold. And a lot of the expansion has happened by leasing farms, which obviously is funded out of cash flow rather than by buying extra land. Okay, so that is, I suppose, the first part of it. The percentage or the amount of grass utilized explains about 45% of the variation in profitability. Okay, so that is by far the most significant, I suppose, factor affecting it. In terms of other cost structures, other things that will affect it, milk composition is a key driver. So milk protein, because we're paid about 2 to 1 on protein, the energy requirement to produce protein is lower than fat. So protein percentage variation has a big impact on profitability. Herd survivability or infertility and cows being culled, the number of lactations the cow produces, also a key driver of profitability. Now, there are some structural issues at farms that affect profitability. Like some farmers are leasing a big proportion of their farm, where other farmers own all of their farm. So obviously that's going to affect profitability as well.
Interesting. I appreciate that clarification. It sounds like grass utilization is the single most important factor, but not the only factor. So,
Yeah.
so that's really helpful. One question from me to Elizabeth. If people put up their electronic hand, will I see that even if I can't see all of the faces, all of the icons?
Yes, or I can pop in and let you know. So yeah, please feel free to come off mute and ask your question live too.
Yeah. So as I said before, folks are welcome to keep putting questions into the chat, or if they want to ask orally, use the raise hand button. I'm not seeing the raise hand button on mine. Is it under React, Elizabeth, or?
That's right. That's right, John. It's under React.
Okay. So if you want to raise your hand, I don't see it there either, to tell you the truth. I hit more. Oh no, sorry, hit React. I got it. You can hit React and hit the raise hand button. That'd be great. So next question from Laura Ginsberg and the DBIC team. With the grazing database that you talked about, what do you do if low forage amounts start to appear across the country? What percentage of farmers use this system, and how did it come into existence initially?
Okay, I'll start at the end. I suppose it came into existence. We built it originally for managing our own farms in the research center. And I suppose that was back about 10, 12 years ago. And I suppose we saw the usefulness and the functionality of it and then launched it to make it available to all dairy farms. In terms of the numbers of dairy farms, so we have about 17,000 dairy farms in Ireland. About 9,000 of them are using it. Okay, but they would generally be the bigger farmers. They represent about 75% of the dairy cows. Okay, so because of they're on average the larger farms are more likely to use it. Sorry, with the other part of the question?
Basically, has there been a case in, like you mentioned, maybe 1 in 5 years you'll get a drought? So
Okay,
I
yeah.
assume that you'd start to see that across all of those farms that are using the system. And is there
Yes.
anything that is there any action taken when you start to see that?
Yeah, so I suppose the farmers, I suppose one part of our resilience is that we have to build fodder supplies and you have to store silage. Okay, and there's lots of other tools in it there that we quantify the amount of silage is in reserves. We can, I suppose, buffer the system. The droughts generally happen in the eastern half of the country rather than the west. And it's a lot more often than we have too much rain and our soils are too wet to get cows out to graze happens a couple of times every year. Whereas the drought, as I said, happen once every 5 years. We buffer, I suppose, initially with silage, but we also buffer it up with grain and we fill up the deficits with grain. But in most years, and I mean in say 19 out of every 20 years, we will grow enough forage over the year as a whole to meet the requirements of the cows. And that, we might get a drought in midsummer, but there are other times in the year when we can build up reserves of feed and we can increase fertilizer usage or put in more grain feeding to allow us to generate more surplus. But I suppose one of the things, as well as looking at current grass growth, we can predict ahead using our weather forecast. We have integrated our weather forecasting into the prediction models for the grass growth. So we can predict grass growth at a farm level. Our farmer can calculate their own predicted grass growth and they can modify that by slowing down their rotation, increasing or reducing the demand, and by putting in more supplement or applying more fertilizer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to Jane and Elizabeth for trying to group questions for us, because some are sort of overlapping. What innovations, technological, ecological, and or social, are critical to supporting grassland agriculture in Ireland? And from what you know about other countries?
Okay. So I suppose the innovations that are critical are, I say, on the cow side, it's the genetics. The genetics, I suppose, and I suppose it's something that we really only started focusing on 20 years ago. And 25 years ago, I suppose we started a breeding specifically a cow for the system. Okay. And we have bred a cow that is specific to our type of system. Okay. And we don't talk about the color of the cow because it doesn't really matter. It's what the cow does. She has to have all those traits that we require. I suppose the second part of the system, the second innovation has been that development of pasture management. I suppose precision pasture management is really critical because that feed supply, because how you manage the pasture today will determine how fast it will grow and the quality of it will be in 2, 3 weeks' time. It's very different to cows that are indoors because the cow does not interact with the feed supply at all. Okay, but in a pasture-based system, the cow interacts with the feed supply, and it's really important to be able to understand that and pull it apart. I suppose the other innovations that are happening at farm level in recent time has been a lot of automation has come on farms to make it easier to manage as scale has increased. And that's automations around heat detection and cow monitoring sensors, stuff like that has happened, particularly in the last few years, to allow farmers to manage bigger scale.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Another question related to the overall system. How much are the benefits that dairy grazing bring to the table? So environmental, socioeconomic, rural development, et cetera. If and how are they quantified in Ireland?
Okay, so I suppose firstly, we're a net importer of grain and a net exporter of milk. So we have no competitive advantage of turning grain into milk. Okay. And we would not be a dairy exporter if we were a grain-based dairy industry. So we don't have a grain-based dairy industry sitting next to us to compare ourselves to. Okay. We have a pasture-based industry, and it's the only thing that can survive. I suppose we have done, I suppose, from an environmental perspective first, we've done footprints on carbon footprints, and we know that we are significantly lower in terms of our CO2 equivalent footprint is, somewhere about 0.75, 0.78, relative to most of the indoor industries are, confined systems are typically around 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of milk produced. Okay, so I suppose that's from an environmental perspective. We know that our pastures are able to retain nutrients much better than cultivated pastures. Okay, or sorry, not cultivated soils growing feeds for confined animals. So we can hold more nutrients in our soils. We know we can have a lot more carbon in our soils because we don't have to cultivate them. I suppose our pastures are sown down to perennial ryegrass and white clover, but they have very long lifespans, typically 20, 30 years you could see pastures persisting for. And because of our climatics and our management, pastures do persist.
Excellent. Thank you. A question from one of the dairy farmers in the room. In your system, what percentage of the herd do you expect needs to be replaced each year because of the failure to breed back in that 80-day window? And can you be any more specific on the goals of the breeding the cows?
Okay, so yeah, so what we'd expect is that each year we replace about 21%, I think, on average. This is across the whole country, and there's farmers doing a lot better and farmers doing worse. But on average, about 21, 22% of the cows are replaced each year. 18% of culled and about 2 to 3% mortality. Okay. So that's where the 21% replacement rate comes from. Of that replacement rate, approximately half are for not being in calf. So that's about 8-9% would typically be culled at the end of the breeding season. So the breeding season is between 70 and 80 days, depending on the farm. And at the end of that breeding season, you'd expect somewhere around 8-9% of the herd not to be in calf. And sorry, the follow-on question was, what was the focus of the breeding program? It's our breeding goal. Yeah. So I said about a third of it is on fertility. And the key trait there is calving interval. So every cow, we have a national animal database. So every animal, every event is recorded in that database. Okay, it's a publicly owned database, and we can see the calving interval of each cow. And that's a key part of the breeding program. The number of days from one calving to the next calving. And we need it to be at 365. Okay. So that's the key breeding goal. And it's, it's a very strong trait, very easily measured and very easily defined trait. And it's the number one trait in our breeding goal. Survivability is in there as well at a lower level. And that's to pick up all the other reasons for culling cows.
Excellent. We're winding down in the amount of time we have left. So what I'd like to do is ask one more question of you from the chat that's related to pasture management and fertilization. But I guess I'd also like to say that I'd be willing to try to get answers to the other questions and share them, I guess, Elizabeth, by email. Is that going to be the way to do it?
Yep, that sounds good. And we'll also share the recording and the resources that we shared after this call.
Excellent. So there's a question, does white clover significantly cut nitrogen use? Is there a big source of nitrogen coming from the clovers in the pasture that's accounted for?
So you measure nitrogen in pounds per acre, is that right? So typically our dairy farmers will apply on a ryegrass only sward or with very low levels of white clover about 160 to 180 pounds per acre. Whereas when they incorporate white clover, we expect the white clover to fix about 80 pounds per acre. So they will typically apply about 100 pounds per acre of artificial nitrogen in early spring usually. I suppose our temperatures in the first 3-4 months of the grazing season are quite low. And like once soil temperatures gets above about 5 to 6 degrees, ryegrass begins to grow. But we have to get up to about 8 to 9 degrees before white clover. So there's a few months early in the season where we're not growing enough and the white clover hasn't really kicked in. So we use artificial nitrogen and we concentrate it in. So probably about 100 pounds of artificial nitrogen per acre going into the white clover systems in early spring.
Excellent. Really, really appreciate the answers you're able to provide. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot more in the chat that we didn't get to in this session, but we will get answers to those and circulate them by email. And as Elizabeth mentioned, make the recording available. I want to remind everybody that in 2 weeks at the same time, so that would be Thursday, the 19th of February, again, 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central. We're going to be digging deeper into the pasture management and feeding related to Irish dairy production. And then also we have 3 weeks after that on March 12th, the third and final webinar in the series. And for that one, we're going to be continuing to collect suggestions and we'll design the topics based around those. So Elizabeth, Jane, is there anything else that we need to say before we sign off on this one?
I don't think so. Thank you all for joining us. Good to see you all. Have a great rest of the day.
Yes. Thanks, everybody, for joining, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Padraig, we're all very appreciative of you making the time and effort to present for us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Have a good day, everybody.